You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Shemesh Israel 5770, 2010. This week's Parsha is Parshas Bimidbar. In the Parsha this week, we see a few different topics that are clearly related, but there's something that's very deep that's going on, that's running through a theme, that's running through all of the topics. And what's interesting is that the Torah begins this new sefer, this new book of the Torah, the fourth book of the 5 books of Moses, and it begins with the concept of Bimidbar. Hashem speaks to Moshe, to Moses, in the wilderness. And he speaks to him not just in the wilderness, but in the Ohel Moed, in the tent of meeting in the sanctuary. And we'll have to see, Be'ezus Hashem, with God's help, at the end of this Parsha podcast, we'll understand exactly why it was necessary for the Torah to begin this concept, to give a prelude to the concept by speaking about the wilderness and speaking about the Ohel Moed. But let's hold that for a moment, and we'll speak about what is the Torah itself speaking about in this week's Parsha. So it speaks about the idea of the counting of the Jewish people. The counting of the Jewish people involved every single person would give a half a shekel, a half of a coin, and they would count up all the coins, and this way they would understand exactly how many Jews there were. Now, it's very interesting, and we need to understand exactly why, but we see that when the Torah is counting the Jewish people, when God asks Moshe Rabbeinu to do so he says to him, count the 12 tribes of the Jewish people. And when we speak about the tribes, we have to remember there were 12 sons of Yaakov. However, there were actually 13 tribes, because 12 of those tribes, so Yosef became Menashe and Ephraim. He had 2 sons, and they became separate tribes of their own. However, Levi, the tribe of Levi, was a separate tribe, a special tribe. And Moshe was specifically instructed by Hashem to count them separately. And we need to understand exactly why is it that the Torah instructs Moshe Rabbeinu to count them separately. What is the deeper understanding of that fact? Another important point that we see is that the Torah, after describing the fact that they are to be counted, so the Torah also describes the formation of the Jewish people, how they would encamp in the Midbar, in the wilderness. And not only would it describe their encampment, but it also described the formation when they encamped and when they were moving. Now, the Torah says that the Levites, they played an integral role when it came to the encampment, as well as when they were moving, in regards to the Mishkan, in regards to the sanctuary. What was their integral role? So they were the ones that surrounded the Mishkan. They acted in a certain sense like a buffer between the Mishkan, between the encampment of the Mishkan itself, and the Jewish people which surrounded the Mishkan. Now, it's also true in regards to the time when they were moving along, when they were traveling through the wilderness. Now, the question is, and it's very interesting, when the verse discusses the fact and describes the fact that the Levim had to be surrounding the sanctuary, so the Torah says that this is in order to protect the Jewish people. If the Levites would not be in that location, if they wouldn't be surrounding the Mishkan, so then it would cause a great ketzif, a great anger to come out upon the Jewish people. It seems that if the Jewish people would not have had the buffer zone of the Levim between themselves and the Mishkan, so it would have caused a great amount of death, heaven forbid, to befall the Jewish people. And the question is, why was that necessary? And what does that teach us? Now, another interesting thing that we find at the end of the Parsha is that when the Torah is describing the way that the Levites, would carry the different kelim, the different vessels of the Mishkan, so the Torah says that there were different parts of the family of the Levites, of the tribe of the Levites. There was Kehas, there was Gershon, there was Merari. These 3 different families of the Levites, each had their own unique job, their own unique purpose, their own things that they would carry, and their own purpose that they would fulfill. So the Torah says that the Kehas, the family of Kehas, would be the ones who would carry the kelim, the vessels of the Kodshei HaKadoshim, of the Holy of Holies, the Ark itself. But the Torah gives them a warning. And the Torah says to them, it's very important to understand that Aaron HaKohen, the high priest, and his sons, those are the ones who have to wrap up and pack away the Aron HaKodesh, the holiest of the vessels. Before the Kehas, the members of that family, the tribe of Levi, before they could touch those vessels, they had to be packed first by Aaron and his sons, by the high priest. And if, heaven forbid, they would do something, if they would look at it or they would touch it before it had been packed away, so then they risked the risk of death. That's what the Torah says. It's very interesting. Even though Kehas were the very ones who were carrying those kelim of the Mishkan, nevertheless, if they would touch them, if they would look at them before it was the proper time, before it had been packed away by Aaron HaKohen, they would pass away, they would lose their lives. And the question is, what is the understanding of it? What is the deeper significance of it? And why is it true? And what does it teach us? Those are the questions that we have in regards to the Mishkan. And now there's a very interesting medrash that's at the beginning, it's not at the beginning of the parasha, but it's brought down, it's from Vayikra, which speaks about the Ohel Moed. And it's brought down in the sefer that I read it from the Midrashim. It's brought down over here at the beginning of the Parsha. And it's a very interesting medrash, and it needs a beer, it needs an explanation. And with Hashem's help, we'll try to understand it, and it will teach us a very great depth about all the other questions that we've asked so far. And the medrash says like this. The medrash says that if the Umas Ha'olam, if the nations of the world would understand how important the Ohel Moed, the sanctuary, was to them, they would do all that was possible in their power to make sure that it was properly protected. And it says as follows. Why is it so important to them? It says as follows. That at Har Sinai, when Moshe Rabbeinu spoke, when Hashem spoke through Moshe Rabbeinu, when Hashem's voice was heard, so at that point, in that time, so the nations of the world, all of the members of the nations of the world began to pass away. They were dying because the voice of Hashem, the voice of God, was so powerful that it caused them to die. Whereas the Jewish people were able to withstand the voice of God. However, what happened was, when the Ohel Moed, when the sanctuary was created and was commanded to the Jewish people to create the sanctuary, and the voice of God was limited to be only in the sanctuary, at that point, so the nations of the world stopped passing away. They no longer were inundated with the overwhelming power of Hashem's voice, and therefore, they were fine. They were able to be saved. So the Ohel Moed acted, in a certain sense, to limit the voice of God so that it wouldn't inundate the world. My question is, how do we understand this? What is the deeper message of this medrash? What is it coming to teach us? Why is it that the Umas Ha'olam, the nations of the world, could not hear God's voice, as it were? The Jewish people could. In fact, it says that the Jewish people, when they heard God's voice, it gave them life. But when it was heard by the nations of the world, it caused them to pass away. The question is, what is the deeper understanding of that? What is it really saying? Now, to understand this, I'd like to share with you a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin is very interesting, and it brings a contradiction between two different statements of our sages. And these two different statements, when understood, give us a tremendous depth for the Medrash and for other questions that we asked. The first statement of our sages is that if a non-Jew learns the Torah, the Gemara says, in one brisa, it says that he's chayiv misa, he's liable for death. How could that be? That's what it says. The Gemara says, hold on a second, there's a contradiction because we have a second brisa, we have another statement of our sages, that if a non-Jew learns the Torah, it's considered as if he's like a Kohen Gadol, he's like the high priest. It's an incredible thing for a non-Jew to learn the Torah, even though he's not commanded. So Gemara says, how do we resolve this? What's the resolution? And by the way, I'd like to point out that of all the people that the brisa, the statement of our sages, could compare a non-Jew who learns Torah to, who is it comparing it to? It's comparing it to a person who's a high priest, the Kohen Gadol, the person who's the greatest, most exalted person in the Jewish people. We need to understand that. Put that question on hold. But let's try to understand, how do we resolve this contradiction between the fact that we find, on one hand, one brisa says that if a non-Jew learns Torah, he's liable for death. And on the other hand, we have a brisa that says if a non-Jew learns Torah, he's like a Kohen Gadol, he's like a high priest. So Gemara explains that the resolution is as follows. That if a non-Jew is learning the laws that pertain to him, the 7 Noachide laws, so then he's considered like a high priest, a Kohen Gadol, because those are the things that he can use to develop his relationship with God. However, if he's learning the laws that do not pertain to him, that he's trying to get involved, he's stepping out of his bounds in a certain sense, into the areas that are reserved for the Jewish people. So then that non-Jew, if he learns the Torah, he's liable for death. And this needs explanation. We need to understand in a deeper sense, what is the understanding of this? However, I believe that the understanding of this actually lies within the statement itself of our sages. And that is that a non-Jew who learns the Torah, he learns the Torah that pertains to him, the 7 Noachide laws, so he's considered like a high priest, a Kohen Gadol. And what that really means, what are the 7 Noachide laws? Those are the special commandments that involve the laws that, for a Noachide, for a non-Jew, those are the laws that involve his relationship with God. If he focuses on what his relationship is with God, he is like a high priest. Who is the high priest? The one who enters into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies. He is able, by focusing on his 7 laws, by focusing on those things that pertain to him, he's able to enter in to the highest place for himself. But if he steps beyond his bounds, if he enters into a place which doesn't belong to him, which belongs to the Jewish people, he doesn't learn the Torah that pertains to him, but he learns the Torah that pertains